So having a good understanding of Node.js, how it works, and how you can tackle with different situations, or how you can write functions which are non-blocking or blocking, and how do you identify them, and how do you write promises, and how do you use callbacks, how do you set timers. After understanding all of these things, then now we need to move to a place where we can apply the knowledge of Node.js and start building our applications, right? So it's like you have to apply your Node.js principles to build a complete full-fledged backend application, right? So when I talk about backend application in the web development perspective, or in the application development is what I would say rather than web development, backend plays a crucial role, or it acts as a middleware between the front end and the database, and it sends the data from the database to the front end. So it acts as kind of a middleware. So it is like an interface between the client and the database, right? So on that basis, REST API is one of the standards which everybody follows, and it is very important to understand what REST API brings as a backend server, or how it adds more value to the backend server, and what exactly is the REST API, and what are the different ways or different methods which are different properties or different principles or different constraints which REST API has brought to us. Let's understand that in very detail, right? So let's get started. Let me open a new text editor, right? So let's talk about different standards or constraints what REST API brings to us. So rest.text. So first of all, what is REST? REST is a standard on top of HTTP or any data communicating protocols. Right? It means REST is kind of bringing a standardization. Like we have different standardizations. For in the case of JavaScript, we have ECMAScript standards, and for different languages, we have different standardizations possible, right? So REST is one such standardization which has brought. And why do we use that standardization, or what is the purpose of that standardization? Because when everybody is building the application, or I would say when everybody is doing some business with it, and one business is going to rely on another, like a perfect example would be flights nowadays are selling their flight tickets on a different or multiple platforms. So that brings more customers to them and more ways for the customer also to buy flight tickets with ease, right? In such scenarios, everybody needs to be on a standard rules, because otherwise the integration becomes very difficult, right? If the two parts, if they are made out of very difficult, like I mean everybody is following their own standards, then they cannot be combined together. So interaction can be only achieved with 100% of success with any application. Let's say I'm working on some technology like Java or Python or Golang or Rust, but the other programming language or whatever it is on different language, then it shouldn't be a barrier for me to interact or combine both of these two, right? So in such cases, a proper standardization is needed, and mainly between the data communication, communicating the data between two applications, right? So REST is one of the one such protocol or one such standard. It is not a protocol, it is a standardization brought in case of mainly on the backend API servers, right? So let's see what is the different constraints, or what are the features of REST, and what are the different methods we have in REST, right? So REST, first of all, REST is the full form of REST is representational state transfer. So it means representational state transfer. So whatever state transfer you are going to do, it should be completely represented or identified, or it means you cannot do any state transfer or data transfer. State here means data, I would say. the data transfer shouldn't happen without any ambiguity or any such things, right? So the four major constraints which REST brings to us, four major constraints which everybody has to follow, is that four major constraints which REST brings to us are: first one, identification of resources. So first of all, identification of resources. Now, what is a resource? Resource is any data on the server. It can be image, it can be image, a table, a PDF, a document, a JSON, or etc. etc. Anything which is storing data, anything which is storing some data. So this is the resource. So first constant in REST is that identification of resources. The interface or whatever API or whatever interface we are designing should uniquely identify each resource present on the server, right? Now, what is this server? Let's understand that also. REST also brings in this clear segregation of client. So REST mainly contains client, server, and resource. So REST always segregates its entire data data communication process into three different entities. Client is the one who is interacting with the server or exchanging the data, right? So data will actually be created from the client always. So client creates the data, right? Client creates the data. Client creates the data. And server is the one who processes the data or sends back to the client when requested, right? And resource is actually the data. Resource is actually the data, right? So identification of resources, the interface should uniquely identify. So we have to uniquely identify somehow whatever resource is present on the server. So you cannot have two resources with same unique, with same ID or whatever ID. It can be UUID or anything, right? First constant is this. Then we have second constant as manipulation of resources through representations. It means that the resources should have unique representation in the server response. So the resources, so whenever we are sending a response, even in that case, we cannot lose the representation of the resource, right? It means because later at some point of time, client wants to modify the resource, and if the response sent is not identifying a resource uniquely, then that uniqueness is lost once the data is being manipulated. And it should be self-descriptive messages. So each resource representation should carry enough information. So when you are representing an entire resource, it should carry exact information about how much size the resource is, what type of it is, what media type, and all the information. So a resource should have proper information which describes it uniquely and also perfect. And also with all metadata. So metadata is also very important, like what type it is, when it was created, when it was modified, when it was updated. So in REST, when you're modifying anything with REST, so you should have a created it column, updated it column, deleted it column. All of these are mandatory. So it's like all the REST API standards are like guidelines to you. It is okay if you're not following the guidelines, but it is a definite guideline given to you, because when you are in the REST API world, maybe at some point of stage, this information is going to be used on the application. And hypermedia as the engine of application state. So it is nothing but, this is the last constant. It is nothing but whatever resource you are sending or storing on the server can only be sent to the client in the form of hyperlink. So when the user clicks on this link, he gets to read the data from the backend, but we are never storing the data on the client side. It's just the URI. URI, that is Uniform Resource Identification. That is how REST APIs are constrained with, right? And these are the 4 different constraints which REST API brings with us or brings with itself. And now REST API clearly segregates the client and server. So client is the one who is requesting the resource and server is the one who is storing the resource, right? And also it ensures that you cannot staleness. So you client should send exact or required information to identify a request. So it cannot send a duplicate request again and again, because staleness of data, or server might store some information in the context that this request has already come to me, so I can direct, instead of contacting with the resource, I can actually send back with my context data. So that is never possible. So server shouldn't be storing any data, because that might lead to staleness, because data is placed in one DB and that database might have multiple middlewares running on it. So multiple applications might try to change the data. So any server should not store any information on the context, and client should send exactly the required information to identify a request. Then we have cacheable, right? So cacheable. So when client wants to say that, or when server wants to say that this API should be cacheable or this data should be cacheable, it should be with the help of, it should be with the help of some identifier. And here we use cache control header. Cache control header. So cacheable can also be achieved, but in this case, it is something like this, right? So REST API mainly has, whenever you are exposing REST API or whenever you are building REST API, you have mainly 4 or 5 methods of communication. One get method, another is post method, another is put method, another is delete method, and another is patch method, right? So these are the 5 methods which are given as part of REST API standards, and each of these methods are definitely needs to be strict according to how we are modifying the resource, or how we are dealing with the resource on the server, with on the database, right? So let's get deep dive into each of these methods and what are the limitations of it and how do you use them and when to use what, right? So let's get started with that. Get. So get, it means that you are getting some existing information from the server. So when a client makes a get request, it means that he's trying to get an existing resources. This information means resources from the server. So in this request, there is no state change. There is no state change. And similarly, in the post method, we have to create. So whenever we are posting or calling using post method, it means we are creating new data on the server, new data or new resources. So post method is, we use post method when a user fills a form and he wants to submit that form to the backend server. So in that cases we use post method, because in post method we create new data on the server side. And in post method, you cannot, what do I say, you try to get only two responses: either it is a success that the data is inserted, or it is not success, right? Put method is when we use put method when we want to modify existing resource on the backend. So on the server, so when we want to modify an existing resource, maybe updating the document, updating the PDF, updating the image, updating a database row, updating a MongoDB document, in any of these cases, we use the put method, right? And the delete itself says that when we want to delete the data on the server, we use the delete method. So now what are we trying to do in each of this? In the patch also, we'll discuss the difference between put and patch. In patch also, we update the data. In patch also, we update the data on the server. But how is it different from put? So put and patch are same, but how is it different from put? I'll explain you. But what are this? So get method, post method, put method. So let me open a postman for you. Let me try to show it, right? So yes, so this is the postman, right? Postman is an interface to communicate or to make API calls, right? So here, if you see, you have get request, post request, put request, patch request, delete request, right? So what are these? So these are the different methods which you assign to a request while you are making a request, right? So if you see here, the curl command of it. So see curl request get. So this request is of type get. It means that in this request, the server or any application in the backend side, they would clearly know that in this request, there is no resource modification happening, but only we are trying to fetch the data which is already present on the backend. And similarly, the post method, when you use the post method, see request post, in this request, we try to create a new data which is not present on the server by posting the data in the request body. So you can pass the request body in any type. It can be form data, it can be URL encoded, it can be raw JSON, text, or anything. So in post, we post the data in the request body and it is accessed or it is passed on the server side to store that information on the backend. And similarly, the put request will understand put one patch. So in both put and patch, we are trying to update the existing data which is present on the server. So put and patch are used for updating, and delete is the same way. Delete method, we are trying to delete an existing record on the backend server, right? Now, the difference between put versus patch, right? So let's say there is an object name, place, age, country, and all of this, right? Now, first we created this data using the post method, and after some time, user wanted to update his country, right? So user want to update his country. Now either he can use put method or patch method, but how are we going to differentiate this? So see, in put method, you always send. So let's say first his name is Vasudev, place Hyderabad, age 100, and country India, right? Now this is my first state. Now I want it to update to same thing, but country is now USA. So maybe I have migrated to USA, right? Now input method, what we do is we always send the entire object. So input method, we always send the entire object to the backend server, and backend servers simply replaces with all the values with this new object. So put method, input method, we should always send the entire state object with the modified values. Whereas in patch method, you don't send the values which are not modified, but only those which are need to be updated. In patch method, we send only that values which are need to be modified in the resource. So this is the high level, or this is the main difference between put or patch in the REST API standards. So in the REST API standards, you can totally ignore all of this, because see, what is the advantage of following this is that, because since you are following REST API and people know that REST API in get, when you are making a GET request, you are not trying to modify any data. So GET requests are indeed cached. So automatically you can cache the GET request, because GET requests are always trying to get the same data from the backend, or maybe it's getting updated very late. So in the same way, post and put methods are cannot be cached because they are posting some data. Caching cannot happen. So in such segregations, and also GET API has its own limitation that it cannot send more data to the backend or more data in the backend when you're using GET method. But when you're using post or put method, you can send the data to the backend server in a bulk way. So there is no limit. Usually it is 128 MB which you can send, right? So all these limitations will be, or all these standardizations will be agreed upon by different companies, and they stick to them so that there won't be any discrepancies when you're following different programming patterns or different programming languages. That's the reason standardization is very important, mainly in terms of backend development. And there are many replacements, and there are many replacements to REST API or upgradations also. REST, we have SOAP, then we have GraphQL. So GraphQL is the latest one. So what is REST or GraphQL? So REST, both are data communicating standardization protocols, right? REST, here server has more control to send the data. So server can decide what data I can send to the client. Send the data to the client, whereas GraphQL, client is given more power. Here client decides what data he wants. So these are the differences between REST and GraphQL, but both play very important role. Or when we are using multiple devices like Android, when you device mobile phone, tablet, and web browser. So based on amount of data which you can display on the backend or front end, you request only that part of data in GraphQL. Whereas REST API, the server decides what I have to send it to the user, and sometimes that's going to be a pain, because server is sending thousands of data, but user is able to display only hundreds of data because that device viewport is very less. So these standardizations are just act as a guidelines to us, and nobody enforces us to follow these guidelines. But when you follow this, your application is certified to be standard, and you can easily integrate with any other companies. Like when flight companies go and integrate with Make My Trip, Yatra, automatically when they say we are following REST API, it means they are already assuming that few of the standardizations have been followed, and hence integration happens very smooth. So that's all about REST API, the constraints and what are the different methods which are given to us by REST API, and what is the difference between put and patch. And also we have different HTTP response codes, right? So I'll broadly classify those response codes into 200x, 300x, and 400x and 500x. So it's nothing but 201, 200, 201 and 202, right? And 300, something like that. So anything. So when it is in 200s, it means that everything is success. It means it is working as expected. And 300 means it is some kind of redirections happening. And 400 means it is a bad request or unauthorized or unauthenticated. So server rejected those requests. And 500 means server itself is down. So when you want to say that server is down or server is not responsive or anything, you have to send some response code in 500. So each response code has its own understanding, and similarly each response code in 400 has its own understanding, its response code in. So all these standardizations are now very clearly assumed, so that when the client makes a request or when he gets back the 200, he's happy because that's what he's expecting and everything's working fine on the backend side. So that's all about REST API standards.